Captain Marcus Chen had always been the kind of man who spoke before he thought. It was a trait that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count, but somehow, it had also earned him respect among his fellow pilots at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. On this particular scorching Arizona morning, Marcus stood outside the flight operations building, coffee in hand, watching the empty runway stretch into the desert heat. The conversation had started innocently enough. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, fresh out of flight school and eager to prove himself, had been complaining about the outdated training aircraft they'd been assigned for the joint exercise. The old T-38 Talons were reliable, sure, but they lacked the modern systems that the newer pilots were used to. Jake kicked at the gravel beneath his boots and shook his head in frustration. "I just don't get why they can't give us something with better avionics," Jake muttered. "How are we supposed to learn real combat scenarios in these museum pieces?" Marcus chuckled and took a sip of his coffee. The younger pilot reminded him of himself when he'd first arrived at the base 5 years ago, full of confidence and completely unaware of how much he still had to learn. Marcus had flown everything from F-16 Fighting Falcons to F-22 Raptors during his career, and he'd learned that a good pilot could make any aircraft sing. "Listen, kid," Marcus said, using the nickname that always made Jake bristle slightly. "A real pilot can handle any aircraft they put him in. It's not about the plane, it's about the person flying it." Jake raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "Easy for you to say. You've been flying the good stuff for years." "That's exactly my point," Marcus replied, his voice carrying that confident tone that had become his signature. "I could take any aircraft they rolled out here and show you how it's done. Any aircraft at all." The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus immediately realized he might have overstepped. But his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Around them, other pilots had begun to gather, drawn by the familiar sound of a friendly challenge brewing. The morning briefing wouldn't start for another hour, and entertainment was hard to come by on a slow Tuesday. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran crew chief with 20 years of experience, wandered over with a grin on his weathered face. "Did I just hear Captain Chen say he could fly anything we put in front of him?" Marcus felt the eyes of his colleagues on him and straightened his shoulders. "That's right. Any aircraft would do," the gathering crowd murmured with interest. These kinds of boasts weren't uncommon among pilots, but Marcus had a reputation for backing up his words with action. Still, something about the way Rodriguez was smiling made Marcus feel like he'd just walked into a trap he couldn't see. "Interesting timing," Rodriguez said, checking his watch. "Because we've got an A-10 Thunderbolt arriving in about 30 minutes. Pilots stopping for fuel and a quick maintenance check before continuing to Nellis." Marcus felt his stomach drop slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog by those who flew it, was a completely different beast from the sleek fighters he was used to. It was built for close air support, designed to fly low and slow while taking heavy fire. The aircraft was famous for its ability to absorb damage and keep flying, but it required a completely different mindset and skill set to operate effectively. "Sure," Marcus said, his voice betraying none of his sudden uncertainty. "Shouldn't be a problem." Jake's expression shifted from annoyance to genuine curiosity. "You've never flown an A-10 before, have you?" "How hard could it be?" Marcus replied with a shrug that he hoped looked more casual than he felt. Same basic principles apply to any aircraft. The truth was, Marcus had always had a healthy respect for A-10 pilots. They flew a different kind of mission, often spending hours in hostile airspace at low altitudes where every enemy with a rifle could take shots at them. It took a special kind of courage and skill to master the Warthog, and Marcus had never had the opportunity to train on one during his career progression through fighters. As if on cue, the distant rumble of twin turbofan engines reached their ears. Everyone turned toward the southern horizon where a small speck was growing larger against the clear blue sky. The A-10 was still several miles out, but even at this distance its distinctive silhouette was unmistakable. The twin engines mounted high on the rear fuselage, the straight wings designed for stability rather than speed, and the massive GAU-8 cannon barrel protruding from beneath the nose like the stinger of some mechanical wasp. "There she is," Rodriguez announced with obvious satisfaction. "Right on time." Marcus watched the approaching aircraft and felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He'd committed himself now, and there was no backing down without losing face in front of his peers. The pilot culture at Davis Monthan was built on confidence and competence, and showing weakness wasn't an option. Still, as the A-10 grew larger in the sky, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if he'd finally bitten off more than he could chew. The aircraft began its approach pattern, and Marcus found himself studying every detail of its flight characteristics. The A-10 flew differently than anything he'd ever piloted. Where his fighters were all about speed and agility, the Thunderbolt was about stability and precision. It moved through the air with a purposeful deliberation that spoke to its ground attack mission. "You know," Jake said quietly, moving closer to Marcus, "it's not too late to say you were just joking around." Marcus glanced at the younger pilot and saw genuine concern in his eyes. Jake might be inexperienced, but he wasn't stupid. He could see that Marcus was stepping into unfamiliar territory, and despite their earlier friction, he was offering an out. "Thanks, but I meant what I said," Marcus replied. "Any aircraft would do." As the words left his mouth, Marcus realized he was about to discover whether his confidence was justified or if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. The A-10 was growing larger by the second, and with it, the moment of truth was approaching fast. The A-10 Thunderbolt touched down on the runway with the characteristic heavy thump that marked its arrival at any airfield. Unlike the graceful landings of the fighters Marcus was used to, the Warthog hit the tarmac with authority, its main landing gear absorbing the impact with practiced efficiency. The twin turbofan engines wound down as the aircraft taxied toward the designated parking area, leaving trails of heat shimmer in the desert air. Marcus watched from the observation area as ground crew members emerged to guide the aircraft into position. The pilot was still hidden behind the tinted canopy, but Marcus could see the figure moving through the post-flight checklist with methodical precision. The A-10 came to a complete stop and the engines finally went silent, leaving only the whisper of wind across the airfield and the distant hum of activity from other parts of the base. "Here we go," Rodriguez muttered, clearly enjoying the show that was about to unfold. "Let's see if Captain Chen's confidence holds up when he meets the pilot." The canopy began to rise with a mechanical whir, and Marcus squinted against the bright morning sun to get his first look at the person he'd essentially challenged to a flying contest. What he expected was another military pilot, probably male, likely with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years flying close air support missions in various hotspots around the world. What he got instead made his mouth go dry and his confident facade crack. Like thin ice, the pilot who emerged from the A-10's cockpit was definitely not what Marcus had expected. She was tall and athletic, moving with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in her environment. Her flight suit fit perfectly, and even from a distance Marcus could see the various patches and insignia that marked her as an experienced combat pilot. But it wasn't her credentials that had caught his attention and frozen him in place. It was everything else about her. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Storm Mitchell had been flying A-10s for 12 years, with 3 combat deployments under her belt, and a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. She was known throughout the Air Force as one of the finest Warthog pilots in service, someone who could make the ungainly ground attack aircraft dance through the sky like a much smaller and more agile fighter. Her call sign Storm had been earned during a mission in Afghanistan, where she'd single-handedly held off an enemy advance for over an hour, allowing ground troops to evacuate wounded personnel under her protective fire. But Marcus knew none of this yet. All he knew was that his simple morning boast had just become infinitely more complicated. Sarah pulled off her helmet and shook out shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the morning light. Her movements were efficient and purposeful as she began her post-flight inspection, walking around the aircraft to check various components and systems. She moved like someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had done it thousands of times before. "Well, this just got interesting," Jake whispered, and Marcus realized his jaw was slightly open. Marcus closed his mouth and tried to regain his composure, but his eyes seemed determined to track Sarah's every movement. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something more than that. It was the way she carried herself, the obvious competence and confidence in every gesture. This was a pilot who commanded respect, and Marcus found himself both intimidated and fascinated in equal measure. Rodriguez was grinning widely now, clearly aware of the effect the A-10 pilot was having on the group of assembled male aviators. Still feeling confident about that any aircraft would do statement, Captain? Marcus forced himself to look away from Sarah and tried to project his usual self-assured demeanor. Of course. Like I said, a good pilot can handle any aircraft. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus felt them ring hollow. The truth was, he was starting to realize that his challenge had taken on dimensions he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about proving he could fly an unfamiliar aircraft anymore. Somehow, without quite understanding how it had happened, it had become about proving himself to the striking pilot, who was currently conducting her. Inspection with military precision. Sarah finished her walk around and headed toward the operations building where they were standing. As she got closer, Marcus could see more details that only added to his growing sense of being out of his depth. Her flight suit bore the patches of multiple combat squadrons, and there was a quietly confident way she moved that spoke of extensive experience in high-stress situations. "Good morning, gentlemen," Sarah said as she approached the group. Her voice was warm but professional, with just a hint of a southern accent that made Marcus think of summer evenings and front porches. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. I understand someone here is interested in taking a look at my aircraft." Rodriguez stepped forward with obvious pleasure. "That would be Captain Chen here. He was just telling us how he could fly any aircraft we put in front of him." Sarah turned her attention to Marcus, and he felt the full force of her gaze like a physical weight. Her eyes were green with flecks of gold, and they seemed to look right through him. For a moment, Marcus forgot how to speak, which was particularly unfortunate since everyone was clearly waiting for him to say something. "Captain Chen?" Sarah prompted, raising one eyebrow slightly. "Is that right?" Marcus cleared his throat and found his voice, though it came out sounding less confident than he'd intended. "Yes, ma'am. Yes. That's correct." "Interesting," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that Marcus couldn't quite read. "And what's your experience with ground attack aircraft, Captain?" The question hit Marcus like a cold splash of water. His experience with ground attack was essentially zero. He'd flown air superiority missions, intercepts, and training exercises, but he'd never worked close air support or the kind of low-altitude, high-threat missions that A-10 pilots specialized in. "I'm primarily a fighter pilot," Marcus admitted, trying to maintain some dignity. "F-16s and F-22s mostly." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Fast movers. That's good flying, but it's quite different from what we do in the Warthog." There was no condescension in her voice, just a statement of fact that somehow made Marcus feel even more foolish for his earlier boast. The two types of flying really were completely different disciplines, and he was beginning to understand just how much he'd underestimated the challenge he'd set for himself. "Would you like to take a look at the aircraft, Captain?" Sarah asked. "Since you're interested in flying it." The way she said it made it clear that she was giving him an opportunity to back down gracefully. Marcus realized that she was actually trying to help him save face, which somehow made the situation even more embarrassing. Here was this accomplished pilot, offering him a dignified exit from a situation he'd created through his own arrogance. Pride, however, is a stubborn thing, and Marcus found himself nodding before his better judgment could stop him. "I'd appreciate that, Colonel." "Excellent," Sarah said with a smile that was equal parts friendly and challenging. "Let's go see what you think of the Thunderbolt." As they walked toward the A-10, Marcus caught Jake shaking his head in what looked like a mixture of admiration and concern. Rodriguez was still grinning like he was watching the best entertainment he'd seen in months, and Marcus himself was beginning to understand that he'd gotten himself into something far more complex than a simple demonstration of flying skills. The morning had started with a casual boast among fellow pilots. Now it was beginning to feel like something that might change everything. Walking alongside Sarah toward the A-10, Marcus tried to process what was happening to him. He'd been around attractive women before, had even dated a few fellow pilots during his career, but there was something different about this situation. Maybe it was the way Sarah carried herself with such quiet confidence, or perhaps it was the growing realization that she was probably a better pilot than he was, despite his earlier boasting. Whatever it was, Marcus found his usual smooth talking abilities had completely deserted him. "So, Captain Chen," Sarah said as they approached the aircraft, "tell me about your most challenging landing." The question seemed innocent enough, but Marcus sensed it was some kind of test. He thought about his experiences and settled on a story that had always impressed other pilots. I had to bring an F-16 down on a damaged runway in Colorado during a training exercise. Crosswinds at 30 knots and half the runway was torn up from construction. Made it with about 50 feet to spare. Sarah nodded politely. That sounds challenging. Good work adapting to the conditions. Her response was professional and appropriate, but Marcus could tell he hadn't impressed her the way he'd hoped. There was something in her tone that suggested she dealt with much more difficult situations on a regular basis. As they reached the A-10, Sarah began what was clearly a practiced briefing, running her hand along the aircraft's armored skin. The A-10 is built around this, she said, patting the massive GAU-8 cannon that dominated the aircraft's nose. Everything else is designed to support this gun and the pilot who fires it. She's not pretty and she's not fast, but she's the toughest aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Marcus examined the cannon with newfound respect. Up close, the weapon was even more impressive than he'd realized. The 7-barrel system was massive, and he could see where the aircraft's structure had been built specifically to accommodate both the gun and its recoil. This wasn't an aircraft with a weapon attached. It was a weapon with an aircraft built around it. The cockpit is surrounded by a titanium bathtub, Sarah continued, climbing up to show him the pilot's position. It's designed to protect the pilot from ground fire up to 23mm rounds. When you're flying close air support, you're going to take hits. The question isn't if, it's how many. As Sarah demonstrated the various controls and systems, Marcus began to understand just how different this aircraft was from anything he'd ever flown. The fighters he was used to were all about speed, altitude, and beyond visual range engagements. They were built to avoid getting hit. The A-10 was built to get hit and keep fighting. The flight characteristics are completely different too, Sarah explained. Maximum speed is only about 450 miles per hour, but we can loiter over a target area for hours. The engines are mounted high and aft to reduce infrared signature and protect them from ground fire. Everything about this bird is designed for survivability in a high-threat environment. Marcus nodded along, but internally he was beginning to grasp the enormity of what he'd committed himself to. Flying the A-10 wasn't just about different controls or procedures. It was about an entirely different philosophy of aviation. The pilots who flew these missions weren't trying to avoid the fight. They were flying directly into it at low altitude, where every enemy soldier with a rifle could potentially bring them down. "Have you ever been shot at, Captain?" Sarah asked suddenly, and the question caught Marcus off guard. "Well, during training exercises, we simulate threat environments, and I've had radar locks from opposing aircraft." "No," Sarah said quietly. Actually shot at. With real bullets intended to kill you." Marcus felt his face warm. "No, I haven't." Sarah's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since they'd met, Marcus saw something that might have been sympathy in her eyes. "It's different," she said simply. "Everything changes when the bullets are real and someone is genuinely trying to kill you. All the training in the world can't really prepare you for that moment when you realize that people are actively attempting to end your life." There was something in her voice that made Marcus understand that Sarah was speaking from direct experience. The patches on her flight suit weren't just decorations. They represented real missions where real people had tried to kill her, and she'd completed her objectives anyway. "I've done 3 combat deployments," Sarah continued. "Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. In the A-10, your job is to get down low where you can see the enemy clearly, and where they can see you just as clearly. You spend your time in the most dangerous airspace possible, because that's where you're most effective at protecting ground troops." As she talked, Marcus found himself watching not just what she was saying, but how she was saying it. There was no bravado in her voice, no attempt to impress him with war stories. She was simply stating facts about her job, the way someone might discuss their daily commute. But the casual way she described flying into hostile fire made Marcus realize just how extraordinary her experience really was. "The hardest part," Sarah said, running her hand along the aircraft's wing, "isn't the fear. You get used to being afraid. Fear keeps you alive. The hardest part is the responsibility. When ground troops call for close air support, they're usually in serious trouble. Your accuracy and timing can mean the difference between saving lives and not saving them." Marcus found himself completely absorbed in her words. This wasn't the kind of flying he'd ever done. His missions had always been about air-to-air combat scenarios, intercepting potential threats or demonstrating air superiority. He'd never had to make split-second decisions that directly determined whether people lived or died. It sounds like incredibly challenging work, Marcus said, and for the first time that morning he spoke without any trace of the confidence that usually characterized his voice. It is, Sarah agreed, but it's also the most rewarding flying I've ever done. When you successfully complete a close air support mission, you know you've made a real difference. You've helped bring people home who might not have made it otherwise. Standing there beside the A-10, listening to Sarah describe her experiences, Marcus began to understand something that had never occurred to him before. He'd always thought of himself as a pilot, but Sarah was something more than that. She was a combat veteran who'd repeatedly put herself in harm's way for others. The confidence he'd always prided himself on suddenly seemed hollow compared to the quiet competence she displayed. So, Sarah said, turning back to face him with a slight smile. Still think any aircraft would do? The question hung in the air between them, and Marcus realized that his answer would determine not just how this encounter proceeded, but how he saw himself as a pilot and as a person. He could maintain his facade and continue with his original boast, or he could acknowledge that he was in the presence of someone whose experience far exceeded his own. Looking into Sarah's green eyes, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. Marcus looked at Sarah for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. The easy confidence that had gotten him into this situation seemed completely inappropriate now. Standing next to the battle-tested A-10 and listening to Sarah describe her combat experiences, his earlier boast felt not just foolish but almost disrespectful. Honestly, Marcus said, his voice quieter than usual, I'm starting to think I may have overestimated my abilities and underestimated the complexity of what you do. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, and Marcus caught what might have been a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She'd clearly been expecting him to maintain his bravado, perhaps even to dig himself deeper into the hole he'd created. His honest admission seemed to catch her off guard. That's not what I expected you to say, she admitted. It's not what I expected to say either, Marcus replied. But listening to you describe combat missions makes me realize that there's a difference between being a pilot and being a warrior. I've been focused on the flying part, but I haven't really considered what it means to take this aircraft into actual combat. The small group of pilots who had followed them to the aircraft was still within earshot, and Marcus could feel their eyes on him. He knew that word of this conversation would spread through the squadron, and his reputation for unshakable confidence would probably take a hit. Strangely, though, he found he didn't care as much as he would have expected. Sarah studied his face for several seconds, as if trying to determine whether his change in attitude was genuine or just another form of performance. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. Tell you what, Captain, she said, I need to do a functional check flight before I continue to Nellis. It's just a short hop to test some systems that were worked on yesterday. Would you like to come along as an observer? You could get a feel for how she handles without actually taking the controls. Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. The offer was generous, especially considering how the conversation had started. It was also exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping for, even if the context had changed completely. I'd be honored, Marcus said, and he meant it. Good, Sarah replied. But I want you to understand something first. Once we're airborne, I'm the aircraft commander. This isn't a training flight or a demonstration. I'll be running through specific test procedures, and safety is the priority. You'll observe and learn, but you won't touch anything without my explicit permission. Understood completely, Marcus assured her. Sarah nodded and turned to address the gathered pilots. We'll be back in about an hour. Sergeant Rodriguez, would you mind having the aircraft refueled while we're up? I'd like to top off the tanks before continuing my trip. No problem, Colonel, Rodriguez replied, though his expression suggested he was somewhat disappointed that the entertainment was moving to a venue where he couldn't watch it unfold. As they prepared for the flight, Sarah handed Marcus a spare helmet and showed him how to adjust the various straps and connections. Her hands were steady and sure as she helped him with the equipment, and Marcus found himself acutely aware of her proximity. There was something about her focused competence that he found almost mesmerizing. The back seat is primarily for maintenance personnel and observers, Sarah explained as they climbed into the aircraft. The controls are limited, so you'll mostly be along for the ride. But you'll get a good sense of how different this is from what you're used to. Settling into the rear seat, Marcus was immediately struck by how different the A-10's cockpit felt compared to his fighters. Everything was more substantial, more heavily built. The canopy was thicker, the seat more armored, and even the instruments seemed designed to withstand punishment. It was like the difference between a sports car and an armored vehicle. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with the same methodical precision Marcus had observed during her post-flight inspection. Every switch position, every gauge reading, every system status was verified before she moved on to the next item. It was clear that this wasn't just routine for her. It was a carefully practiced ritual that could mean the difference between life and death in a combat environment. Davis Monthan Tower. This is Hog 37 requesting taxi for a local functional check flight, Sarah transmitted over the radio. Hog 37, taxi to runway 23 left, wind 210 at 8 knots, came the response. As they began to taxi toward the runway, Marcus felt the aircraft's weight and power in every movement. The A-10 didn't roll smoothly like his fighters. It moved with purpose and authority, like a piece of heavy machinery that happened to be capable of flight. Notice how she feels different on the ground? Sarah asked over the intercom. Higher center of gravity, different weight distribution. Everything about her is built for a different mission. Marcus nodded, though he realized Sarah couldn't see him from the front seat. It's definitely heavier than what I'm used to, he replied. Wait until we get airborne, Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that suggested he was in for a surprise. As they reached the runway and Sarah ran through her final checks, Marcus found himself thinking about how completely his morning had changed direction. He'd started the day planning to show off his flying skills to a group of fellow pilots. Instead, he was about to experience a type of flying he'd never even considered. Guided by a pilot whose expertise far exceeded anything he'd encountered before. The engine spooled up with a distinctive whine that was different from the fighters Marcus knew. Less sharp, more sustained, like the sound of machinery built for endurance rather than pure speed. Sarah released the brakes and the A-10 began its takeoff roll. What happened next challenged every assumption Marcus had about aircraft performance and flight characteristics. The Warthog didn't leap into the air like his fighters. It climbed with deliberate purpose. Each foot of altitude earned through steady application of power rather than explosive acceleration, but there was something oddly reassuring about the way it flew. A stability and predictability that spoke to its ground attack mission. See how stable she is? Sarah's voice came through the headset. That's intentional. When you're trying to hit ground targets while people are shooting at you, you need a platform that's steady and predictable. As they climbed away from Davis Monthan, Marcus began to understand that he wasn't just learning about a different aircraft. He was being introduced to an entirely different philosophy of military aviation. One that prioritized mission effectiveness and pilot survivability over speed and agility. And his teacher was someone who had proven the effectiveness of that philosophy in the most demanding classroom possible, actual combat. The flight was just beginning, but already Marcus knew that it would change how he thought about flying forever. At 3,000 feet above the Arizona desert, Sarah began the functional checks that were the official purpose of their flight. Marcus watched in fascination as she worked through each system, testing everything from the flight controls to the weapon systems with methodical precision. Her movements were economical and confident, never wasted motion, never hesitation. I'm going to demonstrate some low-speed handling characteristics, Sarah announced over the intercom. This is where the A-10 really shows its personality. She reduced power and allowed the aircraft's speed to bleed off until they were flying barely above stall speed. In any fighter Marcus had flown, this would have been an uncomfortable, unstable condition requiring constant control inputs to maintain. The A-10, however, seemed perfectly content to fly at this reduced speed, responding predictably to control inputs and maintaining stable flight. In a fighter, you'd never want to be this slow in a combat environment, Sarah explained. But for close air support, slow speed means better target acquisition and more accurate weapons delivery. The A-10 was designed to operate in this flight regime. She demonstrated a series of steep turns and climbs that showed off the aircraft's maneuverability at low speeds. Despite its ungainly appearance, the Warthog could turn remarkably tightly and respond quickly to control inputs when needed. It was like watching a heavyweight boxer demonstrate surprising agility and grace. Now I'll show you something really interesting, Sarah said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. She rolled the aircraft inverted and held it there for several seconds before rolling back to level flight. The maneuver was smooth and controlled, but it completely challenged Marcus's assumptions about what the ground attack aircraft was capable of. The A-10 can actually do basic aerobatic maneuvers, Sarah explained. It's not something we normally do in combat. But the aircraft is capable of more than most people realize. As they continued the functional checks, Marcus found himself studying not just the aircraft's capabilities but Sarah's technique. Her flying was unlike anything he'd encountered before. Where his fighter training emphasized aggressive maneuvering and split-second reactions, Sarah's approach was more deliberate and methodical. She flew like someone who had learned to think several steps ahead, anticipating problems and preparing solutions before they became critical. "Can I ask you about your combat experience?" Marcus said, surprising himself with the question. "I mean, if you're comfortable talking about it." There was a long pause before Sarah responded. "What would you like to know?" "What's it really like? Flying into combat, I mean. All my training has been theoretical. I've never faced real enemy fire." Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had a different quality, more thoughtful and introspective than before. "The first time is terrifying," she said honestly. "All the training in the world can't prepare you for the moment when you realize that someone is actively trying to kill you. Your heart rate spikes, your mouth goes dry, and you have to force yourself to focus on the mission instead of the fear." Marcus listened intently as she continued. "But you adapt surprisingly quickly. Fear becomes just another factor to manage, like weather or fuel consumption. What's harder to get used to is the responsibility. When ground troops are in trouble and they call for air support, they're counting on you to save their lives. The margin for error is essentially zero." As if to illustrate her point, Sarah began a simulated attack run on a designated target area in the desert below. She dove the A-10 toward the ground at an angle that seemed impossibly steep, lining up on an imaginary target while maintaining perfect control of the aircraft. At what seemed like the last possible moment, she pulled out of the dive and climbed back to altitude. In combat, that dive would be through active anti-aircraft fire, she explained. Tracers, missiles, everything the enemy can throw at you. And you have to maintain your focus and accuracy despite all of that, because friendly troops are depending on your precision. The demonstration had been flawless, but Marcus could imagine how much more challenging it would be with people actively shooting at the aircraft. The courage required to repeatedly fly into such situations was beyond anything he'd ever contemplated. "How do you manage the stress?" Marcus asked. "Training helps," Sarah replied, "but mostly it's about accepting the mission. When you understand that your job is to protect people who can't protect themselves, the fear becomes secondary. You're not thinking about your own safety anymore. You're thinking about getting your people home." As they continued the flight, Marcus began to see Sarah not just as an accomplished pilot, but as someone who had repeatedly chosen to put herself in danger for others. The patches on her flight suit represented real missions where real lives had hung in the balance, and she had performed under that pressure again and again. "I have to admit something," Marcus said. "When I made that boast this morning about being able to fly any aircraft, I was thinking about it purely from a technical perspective. Control inputs, flight characteristics, systems management. I never considered the broader context of what it means to use an aircraft like this in its intended role." "Most pilots don't," Sarah replied without any trace of condescension. "There's nothing wrong with that. Different missions require different skill sets and mindsets. What you do in fighters is important too. Air superiority missions protect all of us by keeping enemy aircraft away from the battlefield." Her generosity in framing his admission made Marcus respect her even more. She could have used his honesty as an opportunity to make him feel foolish, but instead, she was helping him understand the complementary nature of their different roles. "But I think you're right that flying this aircraft effectively requires more than just technical skill," Marcus continued. "It requires a different kind of courage than anything I've experienced." "Courage can be developed," Sarah said. "What's harder to teach is judgment. In close air support, you're often making life or death decisions with incomplete information and very little time to think. That kind of judgment only comes with experience." As they began their approach back to Davis-Monthan, Marcus reflected on how completely the morning had changed his perspective. He'd started the day thinking he understood what it meant to be a military pilot. Now he was beginning to realize how much he still had to learn, not just about flying different aircraft, but about the broader responsibilities that came with military aviation. The landing approach gave Marcus one final demonstration of the A-10's unique characteristics. Sarah brought the aircraft in steep and slow, using techniques that would have been impossible in a fighter. The heavy aircraft settled onto the runway with authority, and Sarah applied the brakes with the same controlled precision she'd shown throughout the flight. As they taxied back to the parking area, Marcus knew that more than just his understanding of aircraft had changed during their time in the air. As the A-10 came to a complete stop and the engines wound down, Marcus sat in the back seat for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened during the flight. The technical aspects of flying the Thunderbolt had been fascinating, but what had really affected him was gaining insight into Sarah's experiences and perspective. He felt like he'd been given a glimpse into a world he'd never really understood before. "So," Sarah said as she began shutting down the aircraft's systems, "what did you think?" "Humbling," Marcus replied honestly. "I came into this thinking that good flying was primarily about aircraft control and systems management. But watching you work, I realized there's a whole dimension to military aviation that I've never really considered." Sarah turned in her seat to look back at him, and Marcus caught something in her expression that might have been approval. "That's a mature perspective, Captain. A lot of pilots never get beyond the technical aspects." As they climbed out of the aircraft, Marcus noticed that the small group of pilots who had witnessed his original boast had grown considerably. Word had apparently spread through the squadron that something interesting was happening. And now there were at least a dozen people waiting to hear about the flight. Jake Morrison was among them, and he approached as soon as Marcus's feet touched the ground. "Well, how was it?" Marcus looked around at the expectant faces and realized that his answer would probably become squadron legend. He could try to save face by downplaying the experience or focusing on the technical aspects he'd mastered. Or he could be honest about what he'd learned. "Eye-opening," Marcus said. "Colonel Mitchell gave me a demonstration of capabilities I didn't even know the A-10 had, and she helped me understand the difference between flying an aircraft and using it effectively in its intended role." Some of the gathered pilots looked slightly disappointed, as if they'd been hoping for either a tale of triumph or a spectacular failure. But Rodriguez, who had been observing the proceedings with obvious interest, was nodding approvingly. "Sounds like you learned something valuable," the senior NCO commented. "I did," Marcus agreed. "I learned that I have a lot more to learn." Sarah had finished her post-flight inspection and was gathering her gear. As she prepared to leave for the operations building, she paused near Marcus. "Captain, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked a short distance away from the group, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure what Sarah wanted to discuss, but her serious expression suggested it was important. "I wanted to thank you," she said, which was the last thing Marcus had expected to hear. "Thank me? For what?" "For being honest about your limitations. For admitting when you were wrong. For listening instead of just waiting for your turn to talk." Sarah's green eyes were direct and sincere. "Those are rare qualities, especially among fighter pilots." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "I should be thanking you. You could have made me look foolish for my boast this morning, but instead you turned it into a learning opportunity." "That boast wasn't entirely wrong, you know," Sarah said with a slight smile. "You probably could learn to fly the A-10 competently with proper training. The technical skills transfer reasonably well. What's harder to teach is the judgment and decision-making that comes with combat experience. Something I definitely lack," Marcus admitted. "But something that can be developed, if you're interested in pursuing it." Sarah paused, as if considering her next words carefully. "Davis Monthan runs a cross-training program for pilots who want to expand their experience base. If you were serious about learning close air support techniques, I could put you in touch with the right people." The offer surprised Marcus. After his morning's display of overconfidence, he wouldn't have blamed Sarah if she'd written him off as just another arrogant fighter pilot. Instead, she was offering to help him pursue exactly what he'd claimed he could already do. "I'd be very interested in that," Marcus said, "but I have to ask why you'd make that offer after watching me put my foot in my mouth so thoroughly this morning." Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Because you took your foot back out again. Because you listened when someone tried to teach you something. And because I think you might actually have the potential to be good at this kind of work, with proper training and the right attitude." Before Marcus could respond, she continued, "I'll be at Nellis for the next 2 weeks running training exercises. If you can arrange some leave time, You could observe some close air support scenarios and get a better feel for what the mission actually involves. The invitation was generous beyond anything Marcus had hoped for, and he found himself struggling for words. That would be incredible. I'd have to clear it with my commander, but I think I could make it work. Good, Sarah said, reaching into her flight suit pocket and pulling out a business card. My contact information is on there. Give me a call when you've worked out the details. As she handed him the card, their fingers touched briefly, and Marcus felt an electric jolt that had nothing to do with static electricity. Sarah's eyes met his for a moment, and he thought he saw something there that went beyond professional courtesy. Colonel Mitchell, he said as she turned to go, I want you to know that this morning has been one of the most educational experiences of my career. I'm glad to hear that, Captain, she replied. And Marcus? You can call me Sarah when we're not in a formal setting. With that, she headed toward the operations building, leaving Marcus standing beside the A-10 with her business card in his hand and his thoughts in complete disarray. What had started as a simple boast about his flying abilities had somehow transformed into an invitation to expand his career in ways he'd never considered. Delivered by a woman who had completely upended his understanding of what it meant to be a military pilot. Jake approached, curiosity written all over his face. What was that about? Marcus looked at the business card in his hand, then at the A-10 Thunderbolt that had started this whole chain of events. I think, he said slowly, it was about a lot more than just aircraft. Around them, the morning routine of the airbase continued, but Marcus felt as if everything had changed. His perspective on flying, on military service, on what it meant to be truly competent at something challenging, had all been transformed in the space of a few hours. And then there was Sarah herself. Professional, accomplished, beautiful, and possessed of a quiet confidence that made his usual swagger seem juvenile by comparison. The invitation to Nellis was ostensibly about learning close air support techniques, but Marcus suspected there might be more to it than that. Either way, he knew he'd be making that phone call. 3 days later, Marcus sat in his squadron commander's office, trying to explain why he needed 2 weeks of leave to observe training exercises at Nellis Air Force Base. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson listened with the patient expression of someone who'd been dealing with pilot requests for most of his career. Let me get this straight. Chen, Patterson said, leaning back in his chair, you want to take leave to watch A-10 training exercises because you've suddenly developed an interest in close air support? Yes, sir, Marcus replied, trying to keep his explanation focused on the professional aspects of the request. I realize that my understanding of ground attack operations has some significant gaps. This would be an opportunity to observe different tactical approaches and expand my knowledge base. Patterson studied him for a long moment. This wouldn't have anything to do with the A-10 pilot who stopped here earlier this week, would it? The one who apparently gave you quite an education in humility? Marcus felt his face warm slightly. Word traveled fast on a military base, and apparently his encounter with Sarah had become common knowledge throughout the squadron. Colonel Mitchell did provide some valuable insights into close air support operations, he admitted. I'll bet she did, Patterson said with a knowing smile. Marcus, I've known you for 3 years. You've never shown the slightest interest in ground attack before. In fact, I seem to remember you once referring to A-10 pilots as glorified truck drivers. The reminder of his past arrogance made Marcus wince. I may have been somewhat narrow in my perspective, sir. Somewhat, Patterson repeated with obvious amusement. Well, whatever caused this sudden change of heart, I think the cross-training could be valuable. You're a good pilot, but you've always been a little too confident for your own good. Maybe spending some time with people who've seen actual combat will give you some perspective. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate the opportunity. Don't thank me yet, Patterson warned. When you get back, I expect a detailed report on what you learned. If this turns out to be just an excuse to chase after an attractive pilot, you'll be flying cargo runs until your next rotation. Understood, sir. 2 days after that conversation, Marcus found himself driving through the Nevada desert toward Nellis Air Force Base. Sarah's business card propped against his dashboard and a mixture of excitement and nervousness churning in his stomach. He'd spoken to her twice on the phone to arrange the details, and both conversations had been professional but warm. Still, he wasn't entirely sure what to expect when he arrived. Nellis Air Force Base was a sprawling complex that served as the Air Force's premier training facility. As Marcus checked in at the visitor center, he was struck by the sheer scale of the operation. Aircraft of every description lined the flight line. From fighters to bombers to specialized training aircraft he didn't immediately recognize. Sarah met him at the operations building, and Marcus felt the same jolt of attraction he'd experienced at Davis-Monthan. She was wearing a standard flight suit, but somehow she made it look like designer clothing. Her smile was genuinely welcoming, though Marcus thought he detected a hint of nervousness in her manner. "Welcome to Nellis, Marcus," she said, extending her hand. "Ready to see how the other half lives?" "More ready than I realized," Marcus replied, shaking her hand and noting that she'd used his first name. "Thank you again for arranging this. My pleasure. I think you'll find the training scenarios here eye-opening." Over the next 10 days, Marcus observed close air support exercises that completely revolutionized his understanding of military aviation. He watched A-10 pilots work with ground controllers to provide precision fire support for infantry units, saw how they coordinated with other aircraft types to create comprehensive battle plans, and observed the split-second decision-making required when friendly forces were in close proximity to targets. But it wasn't just the tactical aspects that impressed him. It was the culture surrounding close air support operations. These pilots operated with a level of mutual respect and professional humility that was different from the competitive atmosphere he was used to in fighter squadrons. They understood that their success was measured not by individual achievement, but by their ability to support others effectively. Sarah proved to be an excellent teacher, patiently explaining the nuances of different scenarios and helping Marcus understand the thought processes behind various tactical decisions. She introduced him to other pilots, many of whom were combat veterans with multiple deployments, and Marcus found himself having conversations that challenged many of his assumptions about military aviation. On the 7th evening of his visit, Sarah invited him to dinner at a restaurant off base. It was the first time they'd socialized outside of a professional context, and Marcus felt the dynamic between them shift subtly but significantly. "So," Sarah said over appetizers, "what do you think so far? Is close air support what you expected?" "It's more complex than I realized," Marcus admitted. "I thought it would be primarily about weapons delivery, but there's so much more involved. The coordination, the communication, the judgment calls when situations develop differently than planned. That's one of the things I love about it," Sarah said. "Every mission is different. You have to be able to adapt constantly." They talked about flying, about their respective careers, about the challenges and rewards of military service. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself sharing more personal details than he normally would, and Sarah reciprocated with stories about her background and experiences. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they waited for dessert. "Of course. Why did you really invite me here? I mean, I'm grateful for the learning opportunity, but training random fighter pilots in close air support techniques isn't exactly your job description." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider her answer carefully. "Honestly, I was impressed by how you handled yourself that morning at Davis-Monthan. Most pilots would have doubled down on their original position or tried to save face somehow. You were willing to admit you were wrong and actually learn something. That's rare, but there's more to it than that, isn't there?" Sarah met his eyes directly. "Yes, there is. I found myself thinking about you after I left Davis-Monthan, about our conversation, about your attitude, about—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "About you as a person, not just as a pilot." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. "I've been thinking about you too. Quite a bit, actually. This could complicate things, you know," Sarah said softly. "Military relationships always do." "It could," Marcus agreed. "But some complications are worth it." The rest of the evening took on a different quality, more personal and intimate than their previous interactions. When Marcus walked Sarah to her car, there was a moment of hesitation before she leaned up and kissed him softly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For proving that not all fighter pilots are arrogant jerks," she replied with a smile. "Thank you for showing me what I was missing," Marcus responded. As Marcus drove back to his hotel that night, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since that morning at Davis-Monthan, when he'd made his overconfident boast. He'd come to Nellis thinking he was learning about different aircraft and tactics, but he'd discovered something much more significant. He'd found someone who challenged him to be better than he'd ever thought he could be, both as a pilot and as a person. And perhaps more importantly, He'd learned that true confidence came not from knowing everything, but from being willing to admit when you didn't know something and then working to learn. Yet the morning that had started with any aircraft would do had led him to understand that it wasn't really about the aircraft at all. It was about the pilot, the mission, and the people you chose to share both with. Looking at Sarah's business card on his dashboard, Marcus smiled. Tomorrow would bring more training, more learning, and more time with the remarkable woman who had turned his world upside down with a single demonstration flight. He could hardly wait.